Hello and welcome to another door in the TooFatLardies Advent Calendar for 2022. We are just about halfway now through the Advent period, so there's still maybe a dozen windows to come and a dozen windows that have already been opened. So if you have not yet had a chance to listen to some of the earlier doors on the Advent Calendar, then don't forget to do a little button pushing on your podcast app or on YouTube to go back and capture some of the earlier doors and see what we've been talking about. Now, it falls to me to open the door for today. So let's see what we've got. Here we go. So, nice picture of a snowman. And if I undo the seal, it says, "Hello, Nick." Now then, this one, it says, "Turning things up a level and pimping your game. How do you add things to make your war game more interesting?" Okay, how do we add things to make our war games more interesting? Okay, good question. More interesting. What does that really mean? More interesting. What makes your games more appealing, maybe? What gives your games a bit of the wow factor? Okay, so if you think about that, then we could think of games maybe in three. Let's put games into three categories. Let's imagine we have, your basic game. It's a very simple game, the basic simple game. Then on top of that, we have a game which goes up, part level. What do we expect to see in a well organized game? And then what do we expect to see that gives it the wow factor that maybe takes it up to an even higher level? Interesting one. And I think actually in some ways we can look at the development of wargaming over the last 30, 40 years and say actually this is quite an interesting question, because when I look back at those tables that I see in the old Donald Featherstone books of tabletops with some fairly rudimentary looking figures, advanced maybe for their time, tables on which hills are made out of bits of cardboard, or carpet tile piled on top of each other, and roads are marked with chalk. And I think if I'd ask that question, what would give your war games table the wow factor? You don't have to go back too far before you start to say, well, a wow factor would be not using chalk roads, maybe using a road that looks like a road, or having rivers that appear to be more like model rivers than just chalks on a tabletop. So I think wow is a concept of its time. What gives our games that wow? How do we turn things up a bit on our table? Depends on where we start from. But so let's think in terms of now. What gives us the basic game? So I see the basic game as obviously having a well organised gaming space, a dedicated table to play it on, with a games mat that at least gives you the right kind of terrain footprint, if you like, to start building your table on. It's nice, of course, if you have the right figures for the period. I think that's a fairly basic requirement. Even nicer if they're painted, of course, although not essential. I look back to my own wargaming history and I've played many times with unpainted figures, especially in the early days when it was perhaps more expected that we would have unpainted figures. I think now it's very much the expectation that we have painted figures. I think also if you're going round to shows, there is, dare I say it, an expectation that the figures that you're looking at on those tables look even more stunning this year than they did last year. So we're always putting pressure on ourselves to create better and better tables, and always asking ourselves, how can we improve on the table we did last year? I know this is a theme that very much runs with people who are putting on games at shows. They're constantly pushing themselves and pushing other people forward to say, how can we improve on the games that we saw last year? What more can we do? And I guess, it's about where you start from, isn't it? That basic game. You can have fantastic, really good fun games without having all these fancy bits and pieces around the edges. but we just like to add them, don't we? I know that I love to add bits and pieces around the edges of my games to make them more individualized, I guess, especially when people are buying and painting the same figures as each other. It's nice to have something in your game that I think makes your game quite individual. So one of the ways, of course, that we can add that individuality is by thinking about the figures that we're using. Now, this is where plastic figures can be really quite good, because plastic figures allow us to create a bit more individuality. So we can turn things up a level and pimp our games by producing figures that are very much tailored to our own desire, if you like. We're not just taking metal figures that are straight out of the mold and producing armies that look the same as everybody else. We're creating, by using plastic figures, we're creating units that look a bit different and can potentially look more different if we utilise our bits box or use a bit of modelling technique to slightly change the figure. So this is where green stuff and a good craft knife and a bit of super glue is your friend, because you can go from creating a bog standard infantryman to creating an infantryman who's got a slightly different look about him. And of course, this means that you can add variety to your games. You can turn your games up a level by using different troop types and having different looking figures on the table. So we're no longer stuck to whatever it is that the manufacturers can give us. We're able to apply our own modelling to create units that aren't otherwise available. And this means our games can have more interest. And of course, it doesn't just end with the figures. We can do this to terrain as well. I'm not a great scratch builder, as we've already established on this advent calendar, but the ability to create bespoke items of terrain, especially now we have that thing 3D printing. There it is, another one on the bingo card of Lard. 3D printing enables us to produce whatever we want on the tabletop if we have access to somebody who's only got the skills to print it. So we can turn our terrain up a level by creating more bespoke items for our games. And things like being a bit different with the way we think about some of the game accessories. Look at jump-off markers, for instance. Now, you can go on the TooFatLardies website and buy a jump-off marker for your Chain of Command army. Or, of course, you can apply a little bit of artistic license and create a jump-off marker that suits that particular game that you're working on. And you can do that from scratch or through using plastics to create jump-off markers. I know people like to do this, create little vignettes that they use as jump-off markers. And they also are a way of turning your games up a little. Just something that isn't quite the basic entry level, but is something a little bit higher up. One of the things I've seen also in terms of game accessories that I think is fantastic is where people have little roster trays that they put next to their table. So, for instance, if I'm running a game, the basic expectation is that I organise my troops and I can put them next to the table for the player so the player can see what their command and units are. I think what I've seen done that's really effective is where people create almost like little cutout trays that allow them to put specific figures in specific parts of that tray that then says what that figure is. So it's, for instance, it says section leader, or it says British leader 1, and then it says rifle team, and the rifle team go in this little part of the cutout tray. These game accessories are all a way of I think making your games look smarter, especially if you're introducing people who are new to the period or unfamiliar with your figures and the way you play things. So at shows, for instance, I think these are fantastically helpful. And I know that whenever I play someone else's game, I find them fantastically helpful as well. If you can identify to me really clearly which 3 figures are the machine gun team, then that makes it a lot easier for me to play the game, and it means that I don't have to worry about using the wrong thing and doing that in the wrong way. So again, force morale trackers. We can use force morale trackers that are provided in the rules, or we can create some kind of specific 3D print. Look at what's available now from Sabotaged, for instance, on the 3D printing circuit. We no longer have to use the paper cutout versions of force morale trackers that are in the rules. Instead, now we can access and we can buy 3D printed unit specific morale trackers. So I have one, for instance, that's a British Airborne Force Morale Tracker, a German Force Morale Tracker, a US 101st Airborne Force Morale Tracker, a 30 Corps Force Morale Tracker. Of course, I've now got 6 or 8 Force Morale Trackers where I would have just had, in the basic game, one paper printout version, but somehow they add a little bit extra to the games. They've got a bit of the wow factor about them, and they make my game a bit unique. Okay, well, what else can we do to pimp up our games? Well, one of the things I see other people do, which I think is really effective, is building interiors. Now, I'm pretty bad at this. I just tend to make my buildings as a bit of a shell, so that when we lift off the roof and to put our figures inside, they're just empty shells. But what I see really effective, and what I think is very lovely when people do it, is the building interiors. Alan Sheward, for instance, puts wallpaper on the inside of his miniature buildings. How bonkers is that? But the truth is that when you lift the lid up, you go, wow, that's great. Isn't that wonderful? And I think when I've seen games where people have put furniture inside their miniature buildings, that I think is really very, very special. And something I'd like to be able to do, but I haven't really done. So I think I need to turn my own attempts up a little bit to do that. Building interiors are good. Scatter, of course, is very easy to do. Adding gardens and boxes, a few flower pots, street lights, jerry cans, all these kind of things on your table, of course, are a nice way to make your table more interesting. There is a downside to that, and I can speak from personal experiences that the more debris and more scatter you put on the table, the more unique you have to make your jump-off markers or deployment markers. And there's one more thing that I see people do that I think really turns things up a level in games. And that's when people use dead figures or casualty figures to help tell the story of the battle that's unfolding. This is something I'd love to do more of, because I just think that there's something special about the way that the trail of those casualties moves across the table, helps you to create the narrative of the game, and means that when you look at the game from the outside, if you're walking past a game at a show, for instance, you can see from the casualties something about the battle that's gone on before. And I think it's just a lovely way that people add a little flavour to their games and that turn things up to make their game even more interesting.